Welcome to CommercialDrones.fm, the podcast that explores the commercial drone industry, the people who power it, and the concepts that drive it. I'm your host, Ian Smith. Hey everybody, and welcome to Commercial Drones FM. Today we've got a very special guest joining us. His name is Brian Wynne, and he is the president and CEO for the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International, or AUVSI as we know it. And AUVSI is the world's largest nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of unmanned systems and robotics. So really cool to have you, Brian, here today, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ian. Great to be here with you.
Great. So maybe you can first kick this off and let us know in your own words, what is AUVSI, and also try to weave in exactly how you got involved with it.
Well, AUVSI is, as you said, it's a large organization. We've been around actually for 45 years, serving the unmanned systems community. Obviously, the organization has evolved a great deal over that time frame, and today we like to think of ourselves as the value chain serving the unmanned systems community in the air domain, in the maritime domain, ground robots, as well as automated vehicles. So, we bring together a very, very diverse community of folks that are bringing some really exciting technologies to the marketplace. And that's kind of what I've done through my career. I'm a Washington suit by training and by trade here in D.C., but I get out as much as I can to talk to folks about what's going on in our technology community and see how we can help work together to do the things that are required and necessary for the technology to get to the mainstream of the marketplace. So a lot of regulatory work, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon whether or not you enjoy that sort of work. A lot of legislative work and a lot of work with the media as well to help people understand what the opportunities are.
And so in preparation for these interviews, I usually do a little bit of LinkedIn and social media stalking. And I noticed that you're a manned aircraft pilot, but are you a Part 107 certified commercial drone operator yet?
I am. I've had my Part 107 plastic for some time now. I was one of the early folks to get that. I would say I've got a lot more experience with manned aircraft than with unmanned aircraft, but I do fly. I don't fly for money. I get paid to do something different, but I try and stay in touch with it as well. And it's really exciting stuff. It's on both the manned and the unmanned side. We're enjoying just a real watershed moment of technology entering the marketplace. And it's fun to see how those things parallel one another and in some instances are enabling one another.
So were you pursuing manned aviation as a career prior to this at all, or is that something you just wanted to do and get your ratings for manned aircraft? I think you're a commercial fixed wing and instrument pilot. That's
right. I went back to training to get my commercial rating because it was what was next. But really, I'm a GA pilot. I fly my own aircraft mainly for transportation. And I'll obviously use it whenever I can to get to a business gig, but mainly it's it's there for enjoyment and but I've never flown for money. I've always been flying as more of an avocation, and but very, very interested in anything that flies, even though I stick to some fairly well-worn paths, I'll say.
So speaking along those lines, actually flying cars, quote unquote, you can call them VTOL or eVTOL aircraft, but they're very similar technology to what our current commercial drones have inside of them. And they're in the news a lot lately and becoming more prevalent. Could you imagine yourself in 5 years commuting in a flying taxi instead of a manned aircraft that you've been using?
I could actually, and it wasn't immediately obvious to me, but the more I thought about it, and the more I've looked at the HANA and what they're doing in Uber Elevate and things like that, ECANG. The more I looked at it, the more I realized, gee whiz, well, first off, let me back up and say my previous job before this was working on electrification of transportation, i.e. electric cars, things that plugged into the grid, using electricity as a fuel to move people and goods. So, and I've been driving electric since 2010. And so the notion of using electric motors, using electric power plants, it's not a foreign idea to me. I can't even, I don't enjoy getting in my wife's combustion engine car anymore, even though she has a very nice car. It just makes too much noise. It's not as quick off the line, et cetera, et cetera. And my aircraft has, got the old Lycoming engine in it, which I think was originally, probably, I don't want to insult Lycoming, but, it's pretty old technology. It's real reliable, but I've only got one of those. And some of the newer platforms that we're looking at, of course, have multiple electric motors running propellers on the leading edges. So the redundancy there, frankly, I find pretty compelling. I'm flying an aircraft with one power plant. It decides it's not going to work anymore, which has never happened to me, by the way. I'm happy to say, touching wood right now. I'm trimming for 92 knots and I'm looking for a place to land. So, this notion of getting in and having multiple redundancy, that's captured my imagination long since. And of course, the reliability of electric motors is phenomenal, vastly fewer moving parts, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really exciting. The idea of getting in and not controlling the vehicle is a little bit is a little bit different, but we're going to face that on the ground as well. We're going to let go of our steering wheels at some point, probably sooner rather than later for some of us, and I think that's going to work out really well.
That's some really good insight, actually. I haven't heard that specific argument before, so it sounds like you definitely have thought about this previously. And so flying cars, or whatever you want to call them, they're going to become more and more of a focus on the podcast as they gain in popularity. But I want to shift focus a little bit over to the Exponential Conference, AUVSI's Exponential Conference. So for those who don't know, AUVSI puts on the largest drone conference in the world, and the conference has recently been rebranded from AUVSI to Exponential. So what I'm alluding to and what I'm trying to ask is what I think, some of the impetus may have been behind the name change from AUVSI's conference to straight up like Exponential with a big X, all in caps. Has there been a focus in unmanned technology from military towards commercial, or has commercial just become much more popular that the conference warranted kind of a name change towards something that sounds kind of bureaucratic and, it's got a very nice initialism there, and now it's like exponential and kind of hip and trendy. Can you give us some insight behind this name change?
That was going on when I arrived in 2015, and the show had already started to take on a much more commercial flavor to it. I don't come from the military side, and so that was a very easy transition for me to just kind of feed into. Today we've still got military platforms on the show floor. And in all the different domains, ground robots, maritime platforms, as well as things that fly. But frankly, that is not as prominent, I don't think, as it was before. And again, this somewhat predates me. I think this trend was long underway when I arrived in 2015. So we've actually gone the other direction now, which is to say we had an event here in Washington, D.C. area called Program Review, which was very oriented toward the defense side of the world. That has now been rebranded to Unmanned Systems, Defense, Protection, and Security. And so we've now got an additional platform, which is, again, located here. It's going to be located at the Gaylord in Maryland, which is not far from the center of the defense universe, which of course would be the Pentagon. And but it's not meant to be specifically defense only. Defense, protection, security gets us into some of the counter strategies, some of the tracking and counter strategies that are increasingly important, not just to government agencies, but to everyone from the National Football League to utilities and other sensitive infrastructure. So there's a lot of different elements to that. Exponential continues to be the big tent for us, and that's really been the focus here. Is how do we widen the tent? How do we make sure that this very, very diverse group of folks that are coming together, and most importantly, the customers that we're all trying to attract and that are going to pull this technology into the mainstream, that they feel comfortable, including military users. What I'm hearing from those folks increasingly that is of interest to them at Exponential, and just generally speaking, is they are trying to fast follow the commercial side because they recognize that the iterations are much faster, and that they can benefit from, as they have with so many other technologies, from the acceleration that's going on on the commercial side. So I think at the end of the day, it's we have the most diverse platform, both from the standpoint of the kinds of applications that one can see. We've made a very, very specific and determined effort, and I think we're seeing results from that now. We certainly saw it in Dallas, and we'll see it again in Denver, to bring in the customers from the construction industry, the insurance industry, the utility industry, et cetera, the agricultural industry, and the defense will be part of that.
As we're talking, actually, it's incredibly interesting talking about the defense and military side of things in regards to drones. And we're recording this. It's around late August, September 2017. And in the news lately, there's been kind of a collision of sorts between the commercial world and the military world, in that DJI, a very obviously well-known drone manufacturer, has been under quite a bit of scrutiny lately, and the U.S. Army issued a memo to cease the internal use of all DJI products because they seem to have security vulnerabilities. And so as of yesterday, or today, I think, DJI is sponsoring a Bug Bash. They're basically calling upon their own community to pay cash bounties to them for found vulnerabilities in their drone systems. And they're paying these to security experts who notify them of these vulnerabilities in their software. What are your thoughts, Brian, on this interesting dichotomy between the commercial and military drone worlds meeting? What do you have to say, and kind of what can you bring to the conversation on this dynamic here?
Well, my previous answer, I made it sound like it's really easy to do that for the world of technology to live side by side with this other world of defense and defense applications, and that's really an oversimplification. And I think the example you're bringing up is a good one. In many respects, the foundations and the hallmarks of unmanned systems technology have military origins, and that's not uncommon. A lot of people don't realize SMS and texting was invented by the Israelis during the 7-Day War. A lot of technologies are developed out of necessity, and high stress environments, high stake environments like the military faces every day have a tendency to drive those kinds of requirements and push those technological boundaries. The quadcopter world, and and I've been to Shenzhen's headquarters or DJI's headquarters in Shenzhen. Very, very impressive company. Obviously, very involved in AUVSI. We have a member of our board now from DJI, et cetera. So they are, and others that are coming from the technology world aren't necessarily directly connected to that particular history. So we do find, I call it rip currents. I just got back from my vacation at the beach, and there's a lot of rip current stuff going on out there. I like those kind of beaches, and that's what we see in technology communities like this. There's a big push for people to benefit from one another, but there's also a highly competitive environment. And sometimes we run into these sorts of things. Open source is a great concept. It doesn't necessarily translate over to the military, for example. And so I think, and the military from its side, it's always talking about commercial off-the-shelf COTS, but it doesn't necessarily, when it comes right down to it doesn't necessarily trust that. If they can't test the veracity of everything that's there, themselves to a very, very high level, then suddenly they start to put things out of bounds. So I think there's a lot of tension here. That's not uncommon for our particular segment. I think I've seen that in other technology areas as well. And one way or the other, it's early days for this particular phase where we're getting rapid expansion. I think we're going to work our way through it.
So now we have a question coming from one of the podcast listeners. This is an interesting question. I don't know if you keep up with blockchain technology very much, but it has to do with blockchain tech. The question is, what are your thoughts on deploying UTM, unmanned traffic management, on the Ethereum blockchain or whatever blockchain is applicable? And so there's a company out there that made this proposal via press release, and they've already been working on it. Essentially, they have 3 components to their blockchain drone system, and there's kind of a registration system, a communication system, and a geofencing and ATC system, all running on the Ethereum blockchain. And what the registration system allows is for these smart contracts, these immutable records that make drones these completely independent economic agents for registration purposes. Basically, meaning that you wouldn't be able to spoof a registration as someone else for a drone. And then there's the communication system, which would use the Mavlink protocol and the blockchain to increase cybersecurity protection of the system. And then the geofencing and ATC portion of the system would be storing map data like no-fly zones using the peer-to-peer network, with the drones kind of talking to each other as nodes. So this would combine connected drones, flying IoT devices basically that are connected to the internet. I mean, is this going a bit beyond what you're thinking at this time? And what kind of thoughts do you have around new technology like blockchain being used for more secure drone operations and enabling things like that? I mean, the technology lends itself fairly well for uses such as this, and I've been searching for a killer use case of blockchain and drones, and this one seems to be really interesting to me.
Well, I would truthfully, I understood all of the topics that you raised in that very lengthy question, but I know that any single one of them, there are probably thousands of AUVSI members that know a good deal more about any single one of them than I do. And that's probably the reason why I have the title that I have, because I at the end of the day, our job is to get the right people that can answer those questions in a room. Occasionally, I'll be the guy locking the door from the outside, not letting them out until they've actually consented around a solution. But what I can say, based on in response to the question, is that we've got to solve this challenge, and I'm absolutely certain that we can solve this challenge. And I know that blockchain, is an extremely important technology for cybersecurity in many realms, right? And there are questions of how do you find the balance? How secure can you make a link without creating latency problems, which obviously wouldn't work very well in an aviation environment, particularly when you're talking about automated systems or autonomous systems. So this is, these are, but happily we have, we have people, I'm sure, like the folks that asked the question, who are working on these things and that are working on technologies that can scale across many different applications, UTM being the one that we tend to care about the most, because that's the holy grail, is it not? I mean, the holy grail is to be able to fly drones beyond visual line of sight, ultimately autonomously, and have them be able to interact not only with one another, but with manned aircraft, potentially manned aircraft that are not participating in that system directly. That's a system of systems. We know how to do those things. We have those things. We're talking on a system of systems right now that's, taking voice, breaking up into bits and bytes and reassembling at the other end almost instantaneously, thousands of miles away. So these are things that we know how to do. One way or the other, whatever technology gets us to the goal fastest, I think, and securest is going to be really, really critical. And the wider we have participation in the community in solving and addressing these challenges, the faster we're going to get there.
Makes sense. Yeah, latency is a huge issue in regards to aviation safety. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when speaking about the blockchain. But the next question comes to us again from a listener. So generally asking your opinion on the regulatory enforcement around drone operations, it's a tough one. I mean, so here it is. Whose responsibility is it to go after rogue operators that defy rules and regulations? So I'm kind of glad I'm not being asked this question, but what are your general thoughts on that? I mean, enforcing regulations, you've got all these people with this new drone technology. Someone out there could be a bad actor, a rogue operator. So how do we tackle this kind of challenge in regards to drone regulatory enforcement?
Well, it's a layered solution. Education is the go-to answer here, and folks are probably well familiar with Know Before You Fly. That's something we continue to put a lot of resource into, and we've garnered through the support of the Academy of Model Aeronautics, AMA, and the FAA. We've been able to get a whole bunch of organizations behind that. And the objective with that is, from my perspective, at a minimum, make certain that there's no excuse for somebody out there doing something that's irresponsible. There shouldn't be any opportunity for somebody to say, "Hey, gee, I just didn't know that." That they would have to literally dig by information that's in their packaging of their drone, et cetera, et cetera. And in many instances, that's where we're getting to very quickly, thanks to the 120, 130 supporters we've got for that program. I tend to think that, as a pilot, it works better when we self-police our own community. And in aviation, there's old world aviation like I'm used to. We are very, very proud of the term airman. Right. I'm an airman. I have a sense of responsibility, accountability when I fly in an aircraft and I log that pilot and command time. I have a sense of pride that I was able to do that, bear the responsibility that comes along with pilot and command, which is completely on the shoulders of the pilot to make sure that there's that there's a safe conclusion to the flight. And to do it well, to do it as a credit to people that fly aircraft. Remote pilots are also pilots in command. It's remote pilot in command in Part 107. So this is really, really important. People have to understand that you can fly under two parts of the regulations. You can fly under Part 101, which is essentially the 336 rules, which says, you have to be flying under community-based rules, or you can fly under Part 107. But you can't do it any other way. So one way or the other, if you're going to fly an aircraft in the airspace, you're subject to FAA regulations. It's either Part 101 or it's Part 107. And those rules apply to you whether you are a certificated operator or not. You only need to be certificated if you're flying for money. So a lot of people don't understand that there are rules, and if they're flagrantly violating those rules, they are subject to penalties. Now, to your question about enforcement, I think we have to let a community of sort of a culture of safety and responsibility emerge here. I know that there are things going on out there that we're not best pleased with right now, but I think that over time we're going to get to the bottom of this. The final end of this is I think we have got to leverage the interest and the goodwill of the public safety community. And that's something that we're working on very, very diligently here at AUVSI. We recently announced a partnership with a group of public safety experts on UAS. And I think there's a phenomenal amount of goodwill out there among public safety officials who really, really, really want to use this technology. They know its benefits for a whole variety of things, whether it's search and rescue or firefighting or doing accident investigations, something very simple but could be potentially very dangerous and disruptive on the roads. And at the end of the day, they're our last line of defense. If somebody is doing something that's unsafe, they need to know the rules. They, like our other Part 107 users, do not want their privileges curtailed. They're going to say something, and if need be, they're going to enforce the rules. I don't think that we can rely on FSDOs from the FAA to do that kind of work. I think they've got a pretty heavy lift on their hands already with manned aircraft.
Yeah, totally agree, especially with the self-policing portion of that. Since we're still in this very early stage, but the scale of growth, the massive scale of this drone technology and the rate at which it's growing is what really is going to be a challenge. And I think the integration, the UTM, is going to play a huge role in this. The last thing that I have to ask before we cut off the mics is, so basically, what can we expect, Brian, from AUVSI as we move forward from late 2017 and beyond into the future? What role is AUVSI going to play in this?
Well, a lot of really exciting things going on. We've been talking at AUVSI for many years about all of the jobs that are going to be created with this technology. We're now in the process of helping that process and walking that talk by working with our folks that are doing training programs out there. We have a remote pilots council that's been stood up of Part 107 operators, looking at, from the frontline point of view, what are the challenges that are out there? What's the variability and understanding among the pilots, among the FAA regulators that are in the field, et cetera, et cetera? How do we learn from each other, particularly at the local level through our chapters? And all of that rolls up into information that we can provide to the folks that are doing rulemakings at the highest levels. We're plugging in another ARC got launched today on access to the airspace that's going to address larger platforms, transitioning airspace up to Class A, which is 18,000 and above, all the way up to upper E airspace. There's just a lot of things that are going on. And of course, AUVSI, we continue to work in other domains as well, and look for, as we talked about a little bit earlier, technologies that can scale across domains. For example, if we can learn how to do collision avoidance on the ground where there's a lot more things to hit, what can we learn from that to make it safer to do autonomous vehicles up in the sky, where they're integrated with manned aircraft and so forth. So, all of this is being done through the membership. We do a good job of getting the members in the room and making sure that we're focusing on the right questions, making sure that we have access to the right policy makers, the right legislators, the right funders, et cetera, and try and move this puppy along as fast as we can.
Well, Brian, thank you very much. I definitely learned a lot about what AUVSI is doing and the outlook on the industry from talking to you. So I'm really looking forward to the 2018 Exponential Conference in Denver and hope to see you there.
Great, Ian. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks for joining us. So everyone listening, you can follow AUVSI and get their updates on Twitter at AUVSI. That's Alpha Uniform Victor Sierra India. And check out their website at auvsi.org. And while you're at it, come visit Commercial Drones FM on the web at commercialdrones.fm. And I would love if you can support the show however possible, even just a retweet or something helps. You can follow us on Twitter at Drones Podcast. But if you want to get access to the private invite-only Facebook group that only supporters and previous podcast guests are members of, visit patreon.com/dronespodcast to see how $1 a month can help you support the show and keep it going and also get you access to that group. So that's going to be it for this episode. Once again, we had Brian Wynne, the president and CEO for the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International. Thank you again, Brian, and have a great day, everybody. Cheers.